Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and I thank you for viewing this video, and the topic of this video will be on creativity and on originality. So the content will be pertaining around the question, what is originality, and really does originality exist? And you will see various connections to the video I made on imagination and pertaining in the facts that I used in there and pertaining to answer this question. So how important is originality in the creative process? What is originality, and does originality really exist? I will say that originality, the quality of it is pertaining around novelty, or really the stimulation of novelty in which somebody receives when viewing something. And that just can be due to one's actual experiences, they've never seen it before, or that just being to the fact that it is something that exists in a new, it's something that is a new form of existence that most people haven't experienced. So originality is just the level of novelty that something has. Now if you're operating with the definition of creativity like the one that I operate with, and so far as like making out or trying to make measurements or guesses about it, it's the use of, it's an idea or an object or a thing that is novel and useful, so it has a degree of novelty to it, and it has a degree of practicality to it, or just utility to it. So novelty and utility coming together make something creative. You can stick innovation under this, you can stick just so many different things under it. That's why it's a good definition and one that many researchers use. Now, in that, there is a restriction on novelty, so just there we can start. That originality, though it is novelty, it can just be linked with novelty. Though it's important, it doesn't take the whole cake. So originality is not, it's very important, but not the sole factor in being creative, which is something that can be lost on a lot of people because they think the whole point of being creative is to be completely original or to be wholly original. And in one way that is true, so I don't want to detract from that ambition, but I think in many ways what originality is there for and how it best represents itself is lost because people pursue originality and they totally disavow or ignore the utility aspect of creativity, and you get things that are just completely out there and opaque that have no real salience or use for most individuals or the domain of knowledge or the field that they exist in or whatever. It's sort of what happened, one can think about when art started saying art exists for art's sake and stopped representing things or arranging things in a representative way. And it made art become very, very abstract and just hard to really deal with. And there's people and creative types out there that think that that's the point of it, and so I'll let that stand, and I don't really want to contend with that, but I'm just saying that's what you can get when you go too far on the side of originality or too far in the pursuit of novelty and disavow the aspect of usefulness or utility or it having some sort of in the branch of media insofar as books or music, and it having the ability to relate to someone or somebody being able to look at it and see themselves or use it in relation to themselves and deriving personal meaning and things from it. If one is not able to connect or to use something, it makes it very hard to see the salience or the importance of it. So that is the degree at which I think originality works in the creative process and the two-way street its importance has. Now, what is, I think I should, so does originality exist? And I think, does originality exist, and what is originality will be wedded into one just general monologue, because I think the two address themselves when being answered. And I guess I can start from the point of what is originality. It has a lot to do with imagination, or just in the way imagination works, sort of in the brain's way of creating representations and constructing memory or using memory, which again is basically what I call imagination and what a lot of researchers call imagination, but it may not be what people just spontaneously think or intuitively leap to when they're conceiving of imagination. But two models I think to go at and just to really say something about are the blank slate. Well, no, I shouldn't say the blank slate. I think at least I'll just describe it like this, at least in what I think that a lot of people are thinking of when they think of originality. Is the premise that they can create things ex nihilo, creating something from nothing, and that things arise out of nothing, and things may arise spontaneously and without purpose and in a very random manner, but they don't arise from nothing. Content has to be pre-extant in a space for it to change, be organized, or arranged into something that it didn't previously exist as. So it's things create new things, new orders and new forms emerge, and they emerge out of chaotic structures, but they emerge from something pre-existing nonetheless. So the idea of complete originality, as in nothing being anywhere before and then suddenly coming now in this form, is not true to empirical lens. It's just not true from an empirical standpoint. You can't really find anything that's like that, even within our own universe. So I suppose answering the question, does originality exist? Just in that form, in the way that a lot of people think about it and conceive it, even in their own ideas, a lot of times people think this way. And I was asked a question by one of my subscribers and viewers, and such as that, do I think that there's something as misplaced and not realized inspiration in one's creative outputs in their work? Meaning that there's implicit forms of other ideas in people's work embedded in their work. It's just that they're not conscious and aware of it, so they don't ever mention it, and they're under the guise of being completely original. But if you really pulled apart the work and analyzed it, you could find traces and substances of other work before them. And I think that has a lot to do with just what an idea is per se, but I'm not going to really talk about what an idea is per se in this video. But I think, and I'm going to explain it through the vein of how the mind really works in creating ideas and using memory, and say that, excuse me, and say that, oh, sorry, my lips are really dry, and say that, and say that, yeah, that's a danger, and no, that's not a danger, but that is a true thing. People oftentimes overestimate originality, or look at it through that lens of creating something completely from nothing in their own work, and mistake its role in creativity and what it truly is. Now, for me to say that yes, I do believe originality exists nonetheless, but originality has more to do with associations. So people, we look at objects, well, our brain creates representations. So it looks at the world and it makes a representation. It tends to like to group things, likes to look at information in the environment and make groups and connections between the information so that it can use it and act on it. I mean, that's just the most basic picture I can give you, but one that will suffice in describing just what originality seems to be. Just the fact that the brain likes to create associations and it has a memory based on associations is in it. When you pull up memory, you take some bits of information and pull them out of a certain place in the brain and give it room for new associations to be attached to it to create a complete picture. That's why memory is not reliable, because the thing that you're remembering, chances are that's not really how it completely went. Because you're making your brain, even when it's making memory, is making a picture. It's making a representation. It's using the facts, it's using the information, the facts that got impressed upon it, and trying to blow up the image, sort of blow up the missing pieces and creating the most holistic image given your emotional state and the appearances of things the best it can, and making a picture to represent the narrative at which you've created. So it's a narrative. Memory is very much a narration process in a lot of ways, but narratives aren't always true because they're stories. So it's just that I don't know why people trust memory per se, but that's why memory is witness testimony, and a lot of things are not as reliable as we once thought that they were, or why even in old accounts, it was like in old tradition, it was a witness of it was a witness of more than one person. When 2 or 3 people witnessed about the same thing, then you could accept that it was probably close, or it was the truth. But if that didn't happen, you can't know, because it's not reliable because of the associative makeup or composition of memory. So it is trying to link things to things and make up something. That's what it's trying to do. And the brain is an association making mechanism. That's what it does. It makes associations. It's cross-referential. It says thing in the environment, how does it compare to thing in my mind, or thing within the psychic content that I have. It just, do these things match? If so, why do they match? If not, why don't they match? And then what do I do with it, and how do I arrange it in the scheme I have going on in my brain, given what I'm seeing, given its characteristics and things like that. So associations. Originality has a lot to do with associations because the brain has a lot to do with associations. So when we're talking about somebody coming up with something very original, it is not necessarily the content that they use, but how they associate the content. Sorry. I need to get chapstick. But, it's also why you can look at schizophrenics and listen to their hallucinations, even. And then we'll talk about things that are true. It's even something that's interesting about people who suffer from phobias. Everything that they say, even if you get over the fact that they're crazy, but just listen to what they say, everything they say could be potentially true. It exists within the framework of reality. If they're saying that there's somebody spying on them, is there not the action of espionage going on? Is there not a sort of governmental structures and greater big brother structures that exist to watch and license human behavior? Just the things that the actual ideas, the content of the ideas is not false. They're things arriving from the memory, and things that are real in a certain way, and that are existing and are even apparent, and we can even see them in society. I think the Patriot Act is just a good example that, some of the things that schizophrenics, at least when they're dealing with their delusions about and paranoia, that they're not completely misplaced. It's like crazy people sometimes, and that's why that crazy people at times can seem more sane than just people who we consider not crazy or sane, because the actual content of the actual content that they're making associations with are probably more true and realer than anything else that we know in a lot of ways. But It's really the pattern of associations that they make and how broad their associations are. So people per se who suffer with schizophrenia make broad and loose associations. That's why they sort of come up with the narratives, because the brain, I'm going to use the word narrative instead of representation, because the brain, when we're communicating things and saying things, we're essentially coming up with narratives. We're telling stories. But so the narratives that they're coming up with, the associations, the ideas, how they're associated, are associated in such a loose and antithetical form to what people have been culturized and inundated in a manner to inundated in a way in creating narratives and associations. So part of the process of culturalization and socialization is saying this is how you make a narrative given this society in which people can understand and deal with. And that's a simplification, but that's just a model and a tool that's useful in thinking about originality and just sort of this broader context and picture, the scope at which I'm viewing it from. That's what it's doing. Schizophrenics, or people who we consider insane, are not using that model because their brain, it makes loose associations and will step outside of that narrative framework that we are so comfortable with and that we make and have so deeply embedded within us from the from the time we're 2 and 3 and 4 years old. It's just schizophrenics, people who are we consider crazy, because I'm not going to say what I think about mental illnesses in this video, but we consider crazy or diagnosed that way. They just run buckshot over the forms and structures of narrative that we've been taught that are acceptable by society. And it's in that process, and the reason I bring that up is because you have museums that are comprised of artwork of completely from, you have museums and art galleries that are comprised of artwork from people who you consider completely crazy. They're literally from people that are in the loony bin. Those are the people that make this artwork, and that's what they display on galleries. And sometimes they're bizarre, but a lot of times they're atmospheric, moody, profound even. Just they're different. They load high on the dimension of originality, and they load high on the dimension of originality because of the perception of the individual. The way the brain represents things and makes its associations tend to be very loose and broad-reaching. So loose per se, and when I say loose, I mean something of this manner. If somebody tells somebody, say somebody gives, there's a test that researchers do, divergent testing and associative testing. And this testing I'm talking about is associative testing. So when you want to test somebody's patterns of associations, or in which the way their brain makes associations, you give them a word and say match words to this word. So you give them a word like table, and it'll branch off into all the things you can link with table. Not all the uses for table, not all the ways you can use a table, because that's a divergent thinking tool, but all the associations you can make with the table. What would you associate with table? And I've used this because I took this test, so I've used this because in academia they're always eager to test us like little hamsters. But anyways, so I took this test, and one thing that when I took it, I put periodic because of the periodic table, chemistry. I thought that was just so obvious. Like, if you talk about a table, you could be talking about a periodic table. You can be talking about a multiplication table. You can be talking about a table of interest. You can be talking about a poker table. You can be talking about a pool table. All the things that I associated with table, they were pool and poker were on the intermediate scale of originality, because they have a scale. I don't how the hell you scale originality. I don't know, but it was on the intermediate to high scale. It was little past intermediate, middle, and not quite at high. But then the other associations, I just remember periodic and multiplication because those are the ones that they talked to me a lot about. But there's a few others that I made that they were just like, where do you get that from? And that's because my brain, it does make loose associations to some extent, but that's extroverted intuition. Um, but so, anyways, the point is that when you're looking at originality, it's this associative capacity in a lot of ways, and its association is putting things together or grouping things. And this is the other way that they test somebody's associative capacities. You put you give a person a set of pictures, right? It could be, you could have a lobster, you can have a shell, you can have a walnut within the shell. And now that I'm saying these things, it'll be very obvious to how you associate them. But you put these very seemingly disparate objects, pictures of objects together, and you ask with other objects intermixed in them. So you have something like a soccer ball or something that doesn't have to do something with the broader association you can make about them, and then ask the individuals to circle all the objects that are related and then state why they're related. And I'm remembering that one about the shells because that was one that I took this test, and so that was one that they used. But or you could have something like a orange. You can have something like an orange. You can have something like a soccer ball. You can have something like a globe. You can have something. It's just, what do they all have in common? You have other things intermixed in them. So circle all the ones that have something in common and say what they have all in common is that they're circular. Or they're circular. And I say that because there was a penny there too. So they had a penny. So I circled the penny. They're all circular. And then you can make another association that they're all spheres. So there's associations embedded within associations sometimes. But just the point is that a lot of times when they're looking at the dimension of just novelty or creativity, just the novel dimension of creativity, they're dealing a lot with associations, and they're dealing a lot with divergent thinking. And in terms of the associations, which is where I fundamentally, at least where I think originality arises from, at least it just seems where it's arising from, it's how you put things together. It's just how you put things together, and the groups, and the way in which you arrange groups, which also has something to do with our ability to abstract things, or with abstract thinking in general. It's just that people who are highly original, they do it in a way that's just not necessarily fits convention, or extant with any system of narrative that we're comfortable with. And it seems the more original you are, the more crazy somebody is going to call you. I dare to say that people who are mentally unstable are highly original, not in the sense that they come up with things that are useful, but insofar as that they make associations with things that already exist, that in manners in which they don't exist per se. But there's even patterns in schizophrenics and what they typically say and what they think about. So even there's like limitations. But if you want to talk about the epitome of originality, you're looking at a schizophrenic in some respects. You're looking at a person that has hallucinations, or somebody who's just mentally disturbed in some ways, and they have some personality disorder. It's interesting when you talk to people who suffer from extreme OCD, or bipolar disorder, or anxiety, or depression, or as I mentioned earlier, phobias. You look at somebody who deals with phobias, and you ask them, why won't they? So somebody has a phobia of an elevator. Why won't they go in the elevator? And they'll give you a list of reasons. It's fascinating why you should not trust the elevator. And it's like, if you listen to them, they make a lot of sense. It's like they don't make sense in terms of intuitive expectations. How many times have you gotten on an elevator and these things have happened to you? Not many times, because engineers are good at their jobs, and so they try to prevent these things from happening to you. But what's funny is the engineer does think about all the things that the phobic person thinks about when making the design for the schema of the elevator, you know? It's like all the ideas that they're coming up with, there's really nothing wrong with them. It's the place and where they're using them, per se, and how they're making narratives based on this association, and how they're using these narratives in their lives, and they're using them in a very socially not I shouldn't say they're using them in a socially abusing, abusing isn't the they're using them in a far too socially disruptive manner. I didn't want to use socially disrupting, but I think that's just the best way to say it. Just how they're using the ideas disrupts culture in ways that are just too extreme that people can't tolerate it. So that said, it's just originality in many ways through that sort of comparative analysis is just one's association abilities. Now, what is association? Well, I suppose I kind of already talked about. I suppose I kind of already talked about what association is. It's just to say that originality exists. It's just not. I don't think it's what many people consider. And I think too that people, when they say that there's nothing original in the world or there's nothing new under the sun, they're right to some extent. And when people say that they're completely original, they're right to some extent. It's just that the true picture based on empiricism is the meeting of the two in the middle. That, you know, when you're talking about ex nihilo originality, like you creating something out of nothing, that doesn't exist. And when you're talking about just everything has been done before or has been associated in the same manner before, that's not true either. It's just when one is talking about originality, one is essentially talking about one's ability to make associations. So, just the associations that one makes. Everybody's brain makes associations. Now, when you're looking at, or I suppose, appraising a creative work in terms of its originality, I would again argue that you look for how they use and how they make the associations, and it's something the literary critics do all the time. I think it's just very apparent. A lot of what Shakespeare said was very original. How he used words, and so I think that this is why extroverted intuition takes the cake for iconoclasm or originality in a lot of ways, because it's functionality per se. Originality is a question of functionality and just how you're using a thing and how you're putting it together, sort of how you're grouping it, and then how you're using the group, and where you're allowing the group to show up, and the narratives that you create. You're making a story, you're creating a narrative. If you have in the story Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and Act 4, and you're supposed to introduce the characters in Act 1, but yet you introduce the characters in Act 4, you've done something new, or you've done something that's original. You've not done something that's new per se, but you've done something original, or which is contrary to how we're used to the narrative being set up. And even if you sit there and describe the characters in ways that people don't necessarily create narratives when they're talking or describing a person, because we do that too when we're describing people. That's why police come up with, can you give me a sketch of the individual? Because our brain, memory, it associates things in terms of narratives. And when we describe something, we're using a narrative. He's tall, about 5'9". He had brown eyes and brown hair. And we're making a story, or we're recapitulating an image in a sequence that has sort of a strewn, a sequencing to it that allows another person to better process and understand the information. That's also why people, a lot of times when they're listening to something, and I apologize if I'm making too many associations, they can get lost because sequential patterning that sequential patterning is imperative to a narrative, and our brains tend to follow narratives and like narratives, and it's just how we make up information. So the power of story, who would have known? But that's to say about originality, mainly this, that when one is thinking about originality, when one's looking at it, it has an association with the imagination insofar as it's just taking memory, it's just taking what somebody's already seen in the environment, or what already exists, and it's associating it in different ways. Imagination is the process of recombining things, and what's the difference between recombining something and associating it? Roughly, if you want me to give you an answer, it's just that the recombination of something is subconscious, and I suppose the associations of things is subconscious to a certain extent, but you can have much more conscious control of how you associate things. Psychotherapy and hypnosis seem to have more power over how you construct memory than your rational mind can, or that most problems can. I mean, you can go out and you can essentially go out in reality and have an event and it'll reassociate something, but that's just not something that's privy to the conscious mind per se. And so that's originality roughly, and my thoughts on creativity and on originality. And yes, it does exist. It just doesn't exist how we normally accept it, and originality appears to be associations. And with that said, I hope you found the video insightful and interesting, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.